Good morning, everyone, and a special shout out to my shy but enthusiastic fellow members of the class of '67. So great to see you all here. And Val, thank you for that very generous introduction. And I just want to say, isn't it great to return to our beloved alma mater and find it in such very capable and really inspiring hands? So thank you, Val. When Val called to ask me to give the collection speech this weekend, I was very honored, but I was also very intimidated. But having had a chance to speak to so many of my classmates and to see other, what we now call swatties of all ages here, it's helping to calm my nerves a little bit. Like perhaps some of you, it's been quite a few years since I made it to campus for a reunion. And in fact, I had a pretty good excuse for missing the 25th reunion, which took place on June 6th, 1992. Now, the reason I remember that date so well is because it was the day I married my husband, John Cochran, who's here with me this weekend. And so now we're getting ready to celebrate our 25th anniversary. In the 50 years since our class graduated from Swarthmore, I've had lots of jobs, as you just heard, but only one vocation. And the same is likely true for many of you. And like me, you probably found your calling right here at Swarthmore. But I might not have recognized mine if it hadn't been for the guidance of a wonderful professor, Sam Hines. I was an English literature major, and I thought I might go on to graduate school if I could afford it, and end up teaching the novels of Jane Austen. Now, pretty idyllic, huh? Well, in the meantime, I had started working on the Phoenix in my freshman year and had worked my way up to editor-in-chief by my junior year. In those days, the Phoenix published twice a week, which meant I had 2 late nights of feverish editing, followed by 2 early mornings of proofreading the paper at the printer's shop down in the Ville. At the end of that semester, I was thinking about my future and went to see my advisor, Professor Hines. He very wisely pointed out to me that I was spending about twice as much time each week on the Phoenix as I was on my academic work, and perhaps that was a sign of where my true interests lay. And better still, he knew about the program at the Graduate School of Journalism of Columbia University, and he recommended that I apply. Well, a literary or journalistic career, especially in New York, sounded very appealing. But in those days, publishers hired women only for secretarial positions, and my typing was just not that good. So I went to Columbia, which excelled at turning liberal arts majors into journalists, and that gave me the credentials I needed to get my first job as a trainee on the copy desk of the Washington Evening Star. And that led to 49 fascinating, exciting, and occasionally scary years in journalism. Now, journalism might seem like an odd career choice for a graduate of a college that doesn't even offer a degree in journalism. But in fact, Swarthmore has turned out lots of distinguished journalists, including our own class of '67's Kenneth Turan, who... And Kenny also went to Columbia the same year that I did after we graduated from here. He was the sports editor of the Phoenix for 3 years and was encouraged to think about journalism as a career by no less than Courtney Smith, who had been reading Kenny's sports stories in the Phoenix. Can't say he ever said anything to me about my editorials. In fact, Kenny's first major job was as a sports reporter for the Washington Post. But we also remember Kenny as the impresario of the All-College Movie Committee, which picked the films to be shown on Friday and Saturday nights in Clothier. And for more than 20 years now, Kenny has had a movie buff's dream job as the chief film critic of the Los Angeles Times, and in fact just flew in to join us here from the Cannes Film Festival. Our class also claims Jack White, who had a great career at Time magazine. And here this weekend, I've encountered Elizabeth Daniel Large, George Stein, and Dan Wise, who've all spent part or all of their careers in journalism like me, and I'll bet after I say this, I'll find some other people who have done the same thing. Other journalists from Swarthmore include Victor Navasky of The Nation, David Gelber of 60 Minutes, Kurt Eichenwald of Newsweek, Cindy Levy of Glamour magazine, and syndicated columnist Jamie Steen. Now, we all learned our journalism skills mostly by being self-taught. We learned on the job at the Phoenix, and later generations did the same by working on the Daily Gazette, War Radio, and various magazines. Without the supervision of any faculty members, we were free to make mistakes, get facts wrong, write incomprehensible sentences, and wrong-headedly opine on any subject of our choosing. Exactly what a free press is all about. The New York Times' slogan is all the news that's fit to print, implying a certain primness when it comes to reporting on the world. At the Phoenix, where the deadlines came fast and furious, the slogan was all the news that fits, we print. And it was sometimes a challenge to fill up all that white space. But if we didn't study the pyramid style of writing a news story here at Swarthmore, we certainly learned the values that underlie good journalism. Values such as curiosity, willingness to seek out alternative views, compassion for the underdog. There's a saying that the role of journalism is to afflict the comfortable and comfort the afflicted. That sounds a lot like the lessons that Swarthmore teaches. Put another way, a journalist's job is to seek out the truth and tell it in a credible, trustworthy fashion so that the public can make the best decisions for self-governance. Truth, trust, and the common good. Or to state that idea in language we've grown sadly accustomed to hearing, how do we defend facts in a fake news world? Living in Washington, I've been immersed in what's been happening since January 20th. Many Americans, and you may count yourself in that number, are just sick to death of the onslaught of headlines. With new revelations every afternoon and new tweets every morning, one story follows another until it all becomes a blur. The intensity and the divisions remind me of our class's time on campus, right in the middle of the 60s. The pace of events was almost as fast, but the news reached us much more slowly. I remember joining other students on the steps of the library to listen to a report on a transistor radio about the Gulf of Tonkin resolution that led to a major escalation in Vietnam. The year I went to journalism school was one of the biggest news years ever. The Tet Offensive, Lyndon Johnson's withdrawal from the presidential race, the assassinations of Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy. We rushed out every night to buy the first edition of the New York Times. Seems almost quaint now. There was no cable television, Facebook, or Twitter to bring us instant headlines. The tumult continued during my first years of working in journalism, with the Watergate story making the biggest mark. I remember very well how Watergate began and how it ended. On the morning of June 17, 1972, I was working the early shift on the city desk of the Washington Star. One of my duties was to call the reporter at police headquarters and find out if there were any stories for our Saturday afternoon edition. The reporter ran through a list of robberies, car thefts, there might have been a shooting or two, and then mentioned the arrest of 5 burglars at the headquarters of the Democratic National Committee in the Watergate office building. That sounds interesting, I said. Let me switch you to rewrite. It was well known that the Democrats were having a hard time raising money for their campaign against the well-funded incumbent president, Richard Nixon. What burglars would be dumb enough to try to crack the safe at the DNC? Well, by late morning, it became clear this was no mere robbery attempt, third-rate or otherwise. When the burglars appeared in court, we learned they all worked for the Committee to Re-elect the President, or CREEP as it was later called. They'd been caught wearing rubber gloves and carrying eavesdropping equipment. That night, Carl Bernstein, then a Washington Post Metro reporter, came over for dinner. He and I agreed that this would go straight to the White House. Others at the table with more political experience poo-pooed that. Nixon would have no reason to take such risky and illegal action against a very weak opposition party. All through the fall, Woodward and Bernstein reported on a campaign of dirty tricks, a slush fund to pay for them, and attempts to cut off investigations. Nevertheless, Nixon was reelected in a landslide. It took another 21 months of congressional and judicial investigations to bring matters to the point where the House was poised to vote to impeach Nixon. On August 8, 1974, came word that Nixon was going to make a televised address that night to tell the nation he would resign. For the only time in my career, I got to shout, "Stop the presses," and push the button that sent the order to the press room 2 floors below. Woodward and Bernstein were heroes with a Hollywood movie about their exploits, and a generation decided journalism could be a great career. Today I teach journalism, and my students this semester have asked me, is this like Watergate? The answer is not yet. One key difference is that now the same party controls both the White House and Congress. Nixon faced a Senate and House in the hands of the Democrats who drove the congressional investigations. But it wasn't until his fellow Republicans turned against him that he knew he had to resign. For now, Trump's voters are staying loyal, and elected Republican officials are staying quiet. Nixon detested the press, and his animosity predated Watergate. He made most of his complaints in private, but he did send out his vice president, Spiro Agnew, to deliver broadsides against what he called the nattering nabobs of negativity. Love that alliteration. Donald Trump has taken criticism of the press to a whole new level. He appropriated the term fake news to describe any story he disagrees with. And during the campaign, he denounced what he called the dishonest, lazy, failing media, and incited his crowds to shout at the reporters and camera crews covering him. Some thought that candidate Trump would drop his attacks once he reached the Oval Office. Instead, the attacks have escalated. One of his top aides, Steve Bannon, declared the press to be the opposition party, and the president himself stated unequivocally that the news media is the enemy of the American people. His statements carry the whiff of authoritarianism. During the campaign, he talked about opening up the libel laws that give journalists wide latitude to write about public officials and public figures. We learned recently that he asked then FBI Director Comey if he could bring espionage charges against reporters who write about so-called leaks, something that has never been done before. Trump's derogatory words seem to have a trickle-down effect. In the last few weeks, we've seen reporters getting roughed up when they try to question public officials. Just this week, the Republican candidate for Montana's seat in the House choked and pushed a reporter to the ground, breaking his glasses. This is not the kind of treatment of journalists that we expect in the United States of America. These words and incidents are occurring against a backdrop of declining trust in media, as reflected in polls in recent years. More than half of all Americans now believe journalists produce false stories. Among Trump supporters, that climbs to 78%. That partisan divide is reflected in America's choices of media outlets. Right now, we're seeing a glorious competition between the Washington Post and the New York Times, an old-fashioned newspaper war in which each one tops the other with news scoops almost on a daily basis. But those stories are not reaching a large part of the public who choose news outlets that ignore or downplay stories that reflect critically on the president and his administration. Just 2 weeks ago, screenshots of the 3 cable networks at the same time, same instant really, showed the parallel universe that now exists among news outlets. On CNN, the headline was, "Sources, Comey memo says Trump asked him to end Flynn probe." On MSNBC, it was much the same. Trump asked Comey to end Flynn investigation. And on Fox, Clinton Foundation, where is it now? If citizens are operating with different sets of facts from different news sources and selecting news sources that are most congenial to their political ideology, is it any wonder we're having such trouble as a country reaching agreement on issues and policies? Another factor weighing on journalism is the impact of digital technology, which has decimated the newspaper business and is making inroads into television and radio. More than half of U.S. newspaper jobs disappeared between 2001 and 2016. Local media, which is the most trusted by citizens, is being hollowed out, especially in the heartland. Everyone is still searching for the successful business model to support journalism. Is it a deep-pocketed owner like Jeff Bezos, who has plowed millions into the Washington Post? Is it a nonprofit model like ProPublica that relies on foundation support? Is it a digital paywall like that of the Wall Street Journal, which never gave away its content for free on the internet? There are those who think the hostility from the highest level of government has actually been good for journalism. The New York Times' Washington bureau chief Elizabeth Buemiller said earlier this spring, "There's a renewed sense of mission right now. People are working around the clock. They are working really hard, but it's sort of opened people's eyes, and you could argue that they should have been more open before, about what our role is. And that is to hold the administration accountable through tough, fair-minded coverage." Or as Washington Post editor Marty Barron put it when asked about Trump's claims that he is in a war with the media, "We're not at war, we're at work." And that's exactly what journalists need to do now, show by truthful, factual reporting that they can be trusted and that they are seeking the truth on behalf of the public. That's what the editors at the New York Times and the Washington Post are talking about, and that's what Woodward and Bernstein did 45 years ago. That's what is needed to make sure our democracy functions and that our elected officials are accountable to those they serve. And let's remember, this is not an issue only journalists should care about. Alicia Shepard, the former ombudsman for NPR, wrote this week, "Press freedom isn't just important to journalists. It matters to every citizen in this country who cares about democracy and free speech. There should never be any peril in asking a public official a question, ever. An assault on a journalist is an assault on us all." But enough of these challenges. Enough of these challenges for now. We're here in this beautiful setting and enjoying the very special fellowship that unites all of us who had the good fortune to go to Swarthmore. I'd like to end with another story about my advisor, Professor Hines. Probably because I'd become a teacher myself, I sent him an email letter a few years ago to thank him for the powerful impact he had had on my life. He had moved from Swarthmore to Princeton University, and he'd also written a highly praised memoir about being a pilot during World War II and was a featured speaker in Ken Burns' documentary series, The War. Now in his 90s, he's still writing books, including one that won the Robert F. Kennedy Award. The morning after I sent my email to him, his warm response was waiting in my inbox. He thanked me for getting in touch and then urged me to write a memoir, as he had done. "As you can see," he wrote, "I am an incorrigible advisor." Or, "Once an advisee, always an advisee." He also had some advice for all of us who've reached the retirement years, and for the younger classes here today, it might be good for you to hear this too. "As you can see by my example," he wrote, "retirement can be a beginning, not an end, and writing is a way of demonstrating that. When somebody asked Freud what is necessary to happiness, he replied, love and work. So," Professor Hines concluded, "forge on." And so I say to all of us in this beautiful setting, so full of memories, let's all forge on.